welcome to This Week in Travel. I'm your host Michelle Robson and editor of turningleftforless.com. This week I had a special request from viewer James to take a look at British Airways status and specifically about how you retain it every year. So all those little quirks and rules that perhaps people have questions about, and also we're going to take a look at the latest tier point runs which are the best value. Now these do obviously vary from time to time, so I'm going to cover all the standard ones and what to look out for and some specific ones at the moment. If you have British Airways status, you probably know that your tier point ends on the 8th of the month. What you may not realise is you actually have status until the end of the following month. So for example, if your tier point year ends on the 8th of April, you actually have your card valid until the 31st of May. So you can continue to get all the benefits until the 31st of May. So one thing that I'll mention just whilst we're on the subject is actually if you decided you weren't going to make status this year, you could actually go continuously keeping your status, let's use gold as an example, by actually earning all the tier points between the 9th of the month, so say using the example again, the 9th of April and the 31st of May, and that way there would be no break in the actual perks that you'd receive. It would all be completely seamless, hopefully. Whether you'd actually get the virtual card exactly on time and everything updated, not quite sure, because sometimes it can take a few hours or even 24 hours, 48 hours. However, that is one option to consider. Obviously it's an awful lot of tier points in this example with gold, but with something like bronze, for example, if you needed to book some flights, for example, and wanted to get the seats reserved, which you can do 7 days in advance with bronze, then obviously that could be an option if you had some flights coming up that weren't going to credit in the current year but would credit before your card ends. So always worth bearing in mind. The other thing I'll talk about that people often have a query about is the 8th of the month. So if you fly on the 8th of the month, what happens to the tier points? If you fly overnight on the 8th of the month, what happens there? What happens if you've got several segments but you start on the 8th of the month? So the first thing to know is that everything flown on the 8th of the month in your tier point year end will credit to the current year, providing the takeoff time, and that's the local departure time, not the time in the UK. The local departure time, providing it's on the 8th, it will credit as the 8th. Even if it takes a few days, it will get backdated to the day you actually took the flight. Now, say you were doing something like US to UK, flying on the 8th in the evening, getting back in the 9th, and then you were connecting in London onto Manchester or another domestic. What would happen there is you would only get the tier points for the flight that you took on the 8th, which would be the transatlantic flight, credited to the current tier point year. The connecting sector would be flown on the 9th, local departure time, so that would go into the following year. So hopefully that's cleared that up. One other thing to note that is also a very frequently asked question is that often people say, I'm not going to quite make it, but a week after my tier point year ends, I've got a flight that would actually take me up to gold or silver or whatever it is. Now, British Airways will sometimes give a 2-week extension on collecting tier points if you've got some flights booked in that period. I've never known it be longer than 2 weeks, and they can say no, it's not a given that they'll definitely do it. However, it's always worth asking. And usually they won't do it until fairly close to the time, so I certainly probably wouldn't try until about a month before, because normally they'd be thinking, well, you've got plenty of time to actually sort it out, so we don't need to help you. They do very occasionally extend status without any request from yourself. This year I've known quite a few people that had been a particular level of status for many years that didn't quite make it, and they did actually get given status. But this seems to be a fairly recent thing after COVID, so again, I definitely would not bank on that. That brings me on to something called soft landings. Now, a soft landing means that if you are gold, let's take that as an example again, it means that if you don't make your status again this year, you won't go straight back to blue. You'll actually go to silver, so you go to the next level down. So, for example, if you were silver, you would go to bronze. The only real exception to this is gold guest list. Now, there's some debate over whether the rules have changed with this, because some people are being given a soft landing to gold, but usually because gold guest list is not an actual tier, they treated it as if you were gold and will give you a soft landing to silver. So hopefully they've changed the rules, because I always thought that was particularly unfair that you were treated exactly the same as someone who was gold, even though you'd earned a minimum of twice as much in terms of tier points. So I'm hoping that is a rule change. One thing to mention is as well that soft landings are not a rule that's really written anywhere. So you can't really challenge it as much. I mean, you can ask, but it's kind of an unwritten rule. So in terms of finding out whether the gold guest list rule has changed, it's hard to say. Some people have been told it has. Some people are still getting a soft landing to silver. So time will tell on that. But generally, with the other status, it's quite obvious. With bronze, obviously the next one down is blue, which is the basic one. So there's no soft landing for that. But for everyone else, the good news is you don't go right back to the bottom of the ladder. So at least you're keeping some sort of status. And this is automatic. You shouldn't need to request it. One further thing about requesting status exemptions, I'll say, is during COVID they were pretty good, British Airways. If you phoned up and said, look, I had this flight cancelled, you know, it was a couple of weeks before my tier point end, they would normally then grant you a status extension, because I think that's perfectly fair. Look, if you've planned your year so that you get exactly the right amount of tier points, and then British Airways cancel a flight and for some reason you're unable to take another one instead, I think it's pretty unfair that they don't give you the tier points, because it's not like at that point you've got much time to actually make up the flights. I think if it was, you know, in the middle of your year, their argument would be, well, there's plenty of time for you actually to make up those tier points. But if it's the last couple of weeks, I personally think that they should automatically extend your status. However, they seem to have changed their stance, and I do know people who have tried this and been refused. I think it's very much down to individual discretion how a lot of these things are. If you're someone who made gold for the first time during COVID and you only did it on the reduced amount of tier points and that's the only time you've done it, then I can see them being reluctant to maybe give you any sort of exemptions. However, if you're a long-standing member at that particular tier, then I think they're more likely to be a bit lenient. My view is it's always worth asking. If you don't ask, you don't get. They can say no, but it's definitely worth asking just to see what the status is. So we're now going to go on to what happens if you don't make those tier points. For example, if you've had something cancelled that's kind of ruined your plans fairly last minute and you want to do something to make up the difference. I've talked before a bit about tier point runs. I'm going to do a bit of a repeat with some of it, but I'm also going to talk about some of the latest deals and the sort of pricing you can look at. At the moment, I'm sure you've noticed prices are very expensive. There's not really a way around this other than I would always advise, if you can, trying to book when there's a sale on. Now, it may be that you don't want to part with your money that far in advance. My advice with that is to use it as a holiday. So you can book just one day's car hire or one night. It doesn't even have to be in the place where you're going. You could book a hotel at the airport if you wanted to. So if you do that, then you only have to pay a deposit. So that's worth bearing in mind if you wanted to do something quite expensive. I quite often use that because if it's, you know, a year in advance, I don't really want to give British Airways my money for a whole year, rather than I'd rather keep it in my own bank account. So sometimes I'll just add on a night, and then it means I only have to pay the deposit, and then the rest is around 8 weeks before. So it varies depending on the particular circumstances. So if we look at holidays in particular, there's one particular special offer that you may be aware of that I'll just reiterate now. I have been asked a few times if they're going to extend this offer, and there were some rumours that they would. I'm not convinced personally, because I think they probably have too many people with status at the moment. I think they're trying to reduce that, but who knows? It has made the holiday option very popular. So the offer is the double tier point offer. When you take a British Airways holiday and you add 5 days worth of car or hotel, they don't all have to be in the same place. You can do a twin centre. In fact, the hotel can be absolutely anywhere. It doesn't have to be associated with the holiday. Personally, I would do it for the dates that you've booked for the flights. It doesn't say you have to, but I probably wouldn't risk it. Then you will get double tier points. So double the amount of tier points you would have got for your flights. So the main question that I get asked about this is in terms of the 5-night minimum. One thing that I'll say that is super important is you must book it all at the same time as a British Airways holiday. If you were to buy the flights and then the next day add a hotel on, that will not count. So you have to book it all in one go, and you have to travel by the 31st of December 2023. That's the current deadline. So you haven't got that long if you want to do it. I suspect there will be another sale coming along. There's currently one for economy holidays for the winter, so it would cover November and December if you were looking at that period. So have a look on Turning Left for Less at the offer there. And there will probably be, I would guess, one around autumn time, maybe around the August bank holiday or September, and then definitely there's always one for Black Friday, which is the end of November. So I generally try and book my flights and holidays then, because it is normally a bit cheaper, not always, but I try and do it then. The current sale has some really cheap deals for economy, where it's £300 per person for a 7-night holiday in somewhere like Portugal, and that's based on 2 sharing a room. So that's a pretty good deal, but they are economy, which obviously doesn't help quite so much with the tier points. So that's my top tip, is use the British Airways holiday. Make sure you have 5 nights hotel and car hire. You could do 3 nights hotel, 2 nights car hire. It doesn't have to be or one or the other. It just has to be 5 nights exactly. And as I said, the hotel does not have to be where the flight is to, but I would stick to those dates that you've booked the flights for. They do credit quite quickly now. If you've done it before, you might be thinking, oh no, I'm not going through all that hassle again, where it didn't credit for months and then you had to chase it. Now they seem to credit within about 7 to 10 days. So that definitely helps, but I wouldn't cut it too fine with the end of your tier point year. So let's have a look at the actual tier point runs that are available. Personally, I don't really advocate doing a tier point run. A traditional tier point run would be you fly somewhere and you pretty much turn around and come back again. Obviously, with environmental concern at the moment, that's not great, but I just think what a waste. Even if you've been somewhere before, there's always something new to see. If you haven't been there before, it might not be somewhere that was particularly on your radar, but you can be quite surprised by places. For example, Sofia, which is currently one of the best options for a tier point run, actually has some really beautiful buildings, some nice restaurants, and it's really great value in terms of hotels. There's a really nice Intercontinental there, the Hilton there isn't bad either, so it's definitely worth a look. Sofia is special because it's a what we call short haul plus route. So that's a short haul route that's a bit longer. That means that you get 160 tier points in Club Europe on a return trip. So that's double the normal 80 that you would get elsewhere. There are quite a number of places that are included in this. So if you think about longer routes in Club Europe, it would be the Canary Islands, Greece, Turkey, Sicily, but only Catania, and places like Madeira and Malta. I will do a list on the website that I will link to. So Sofia is the best value at the moment for 160 tier points at around £212 return. The best way to find these fares is to go to British Airways Low Fare Finder, and you can narrow down the exact dates that the cheapest fares are available. If you didn't fancy Sofia, there's not a lot else in the really cheap category. If you wanted to go somewhere that was more of a holiday, or perhaps get your 320 points by doing it as a 5-day holiday, then Lanzarote is available for around £360, Malta as well, and also there's Istanbul is kind of in the middle at about £313, which maybe you don't want 5 nights there, but it's certainly a destination that would be worth staying for a few days to explore. If you wanted only 80 tier points, or even perhaps 40, obviously you can do one-way business class and one-way economy. Then I would be looking at domestic flights. These are pretty cheap if you don't mind when you're flying. Normally the first flight of the day and the last flight of the day are much cheaper, and you can get those for around about £160. So examples of those would be Glasgow, Inverness, Aberdeen. Belfast is a good option if perhaps you want a city break and didn't particularly want to go abroad. That's around the same sort of price, or very slightly more, and that has some really interesting things there to see and do, and some reasonable hotels as well. If you want to go abroad, there's actually a few short breaks that I'd recommend. So Amsterdam is one that's pretty cheap for the 80 tier points, and Luxembourg is consistently one of the cheapest destinations. Now it may sound like Luxembourg's a bit boring and it's all just going to be European bureaucrats, but it's actually very pretty, the centre. You don't need long there. I think 2 nights is definitely enough, unless you wanted to go a bit further afield or you just want to relax. But there's some lovely restaurants. It's got a real French feel to it. There's little cobbled streets. You can go down beneath the city into the countryside, and it's just very pretty. So it's a nice relaxing break. Everything's very close together, and it's normally pretty cheap, round about £160 to £180 return in Club Europe. Another short haul route, but one that gets even more tier points, is Helsinki to Malaga or Lisbon. Now these routes get the same as a long haul flight, so they get 280 tier points return. Now I would generally recommend doing them from Malaga or Lisbon rather than Helsinki, because it's very expensive to actually position to Helsinki compared with the other 2 destinations. Obviously it's worth a look, because it could be it's on a day when actually you can find a cheaper fare to Helsinki. In the summer sometimes actually Malaga and Lisbon can be very expensive, so definitely worth looking at both ends of it. But with that you could get 280 tier points from 1 return flight. What I'd personally do is I'd start in one of the southern European places. Maybe you could spend a few days there after your positioning flight, have a bit of a holiday, and then I would go to Helsinki and I would spend at least 1 night there. It's a great city, it's very pretty, it's lovely in the summer. Go and have your sauna, go on the tram, see all the sights, have a walk around, and then come back, because I think it would be a shame to miss it. Having been quite recently, I really enjoyed it. Another option would be to hop over to Tallinn, which you can do on a ferry, or you can take a short flight over there if you wanted to collect a few more tier points with Finnair. So that's a really good European one that's normally around about £500. It does vary, but if you can get it for about £500 for 280 tier points, that's pretty much as cheap as you're going to get that many. If we're looking at those sort of tier points, another option, but a bit more tricky in terms of positioning, is Abu Dhabi to Jakarta. That's one that actually gets 560 tier points return, as it goes via Sri Lanka. So you need to fly on Sri Lankan, which is part of One World, and that will get you the tier points. Obviously you need to get to Abu Dhabi. You could go in economy or use Avios, but if you wanted to earn even more tier points, you could look at going from Oslo. So Qatar fly to Dubai and Abu Dhabi from Oslo, normally extremely cheaply. So most of the time it's around about £1,100 return. And for that you would get 280 tier points for the main part from Oslo to Doha, where you change planes. And then because it's classed as first class and not business class, on the second part you get 120 tier points for the return trip between Doha and Dubai or Abu Dhabi. So in total you get 400 tier points. So that's not bad value for £1,100. Plus of course Qatar I think are a great airline, and there's some really interesting developments at Doha Airport with the new lounge and the kind of faux Singapore orchard type garden area. So definitely worth going and having a look to explore that. So if we're sticking with being further afield, then we're probably looking next at the US. There are some good deals, but they tend to be 6 months in advance, which can be a bit of a problem if you've got your tier point year coming up fairly soon. The best deals are out of Dublin, 6 months in advance, and there you can be looking as little as £1,200 to the west coast of America. The other way to look at them is to look at the British Airways low fare finder, because there are a couple of good deals on the west coast for Seattle and Portland that are both coming in round about £1,500, which is not bad at all. And plus also there is New York for about £1,400, which is not great, but if you're desperate then it's worth a look. What I would say about the West Coast is this is normally your friend when it comes to tier point runs, because if you can break your journey in New York and do a transcontinental service with American Airlines, then you get another 280 tier points. So that is from New York to LA or San Francisco. So if you do that and then you could even fly on further, for example, then you would get another 40 tier points if you flew on from there. But if you wanted to go to LA or San Francisco, then make sure you break your trip in New York and transfer onto American Airlines on a direct flight to one of those 2 destinations. Obviously, if you did this on one of the double tier points holidays, then you'd be looking at 1,120 points, which is a huge amount just in the one trip. But you need to book your 5 days accommodation or car hire. Actually, by booking through British Airways, I will just say that I find the car hire in the US very cheap. using British Airways and Avis, because I've actually compared by booking direct, and sometimes it can be a quarter of the price booking through British Airways. So if you get planning to hire a car, it's always worth comparing the prices of the two. And one of the things we covered recently is just worth bearing in mind that British Airways were giving out a status with Avis, which I will link below in case you wanted to increase your status with them and don't already have it. So that's all my tips for extending status with British Airways. If you've got a tip or a question, feel free to pop them in the comments below. But for now, that's all for this week in travel. I'll see you next time, and until then, happy travels.